At 5:23 a.m. on September 14, 1967, Sergeant Thomas "Doc" Howell crouched in the elephant grass outside Quang Tri Province, watching his patrol of 12 men from Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, move down the trail ahead of him in the gray pre-dawn light. He had warned Lieutenant Brennan 3 times in the past week about the intelligence reports, about the Chinese directional mines the NVA were using, about the pattern of ambushes that always started the same way. A massive blast from the tree line that turned men into meat before they even knew what hit them. But Brennan was 23 years old, fresh from officer training, and he had never seen a DH-10 in action. Neither had battalion command when Howell filed his report after the last patrol found wire and blast marks on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The official response came back, stamped in red. Unconfirmed threat. Maintain standard patrol protocols. In the next 47 seconds, that dismissal would cost 11 men their lives and change U.S. mine warfare doctrine forever. The morning mist hung thick enough to taste. Howell could hear the point man, Lance Corporal Martinez, whistling softly as he moved, his M16 at the ready, his eyes scanning the tree line 200 yards ahead where the trail curved into thick jungle. Behind Martinez came Brennan, then 9 more Marines spread out in standard patrol formation, 5 yards between each man, weapons at low ready. They were looking for a reported NVA supply cache 2 clicks north. Intelligence said the cache was lightly guarded. Intelligence was often wrong in Vietnam, but orders were orders. Howell had fallen back deliberately, creating distance. Something felt wrong. The jungle was too quiet. No birds, no insects, nothing but the soft crunch of boots on packed earth and the rustle of equipment. He'd learned to trust that feeling during his first tour in 1965, and it had kept him alive through Ia Drang Valley when half his company died in the first hour. The wire was there. He couldn't see it, but he knew it was there, hidden in the foliage, waiting. He opened his mouth to shout a warning. The explosion came first. The blast was unlike anything the standard M14 toe popper or even the M16 bouncing Betty could produce. This was a directional wave of destruction, a solid wall of shrapnel that erupted from a tree 15 feet above the ground, angled down the trail like the wrath of God. 700 steel cylinders, each 1/4 inch in diameter, packed in wax and propelled by 2 pounds of high explosive, swept through the patrol formation at nearly 4,000 feet per second. The sound came after, a deep bass boom that rolled across the rice paddies and echoed off the mountains. Martinez died first. The blast caught him from behind, shredding his back and severing his spine. He was dead before he hit the ground. The 4 men behind him, Corporal Jenkins, PFC Richardson, PFC Nguyen, and Private First Class Coleman, took the main force of the blast. Their bodies jerked like puppets with cut strings and fell in a tangle of limbs and equipment. Lieutenant Brennan caught the edge of the blast pattern. Steel fragments tore through his left arm and torso, puncturing his lung and fracturing 3 ribs. He went down hard, gasping for air that wouldn't come, blood soaking into the red clay. The Marines behind him dove for cover, some into the drainage ditch that ran alongside the trail, others into the elephant grass. They returned fire blindly, spraying the tree line with automatic weapons fire, but there was nothing to shoot at. No muzzle flashes, no movement, nothing but green jungle and morning mist. Howell hit the ground the moment he heard the blast, his face pressed into the dirt, his hands over his head. Shrapnel whined overhead, clipping leaves and branches. He stayed down for 3 seconds, counting. waiting for the secondary ambush that he knew would come. It didn't. The enemy wasn't there. They'd set the mine hours ago, maybe even days ago, and they were long gone. This wasn't an ambush. This was industrial-scale killing, warfare reduced to mathematics and physics. Place the mine, aim it down the trail, run the wire back 200 yards, wait for the patrol to walk into the kill zone, push the detonator, collect the bodies later for weapons and equipment. Simple, efficient, terrifying. When Howell finally looked up, the trail was a slaughter yard. 5 men dead, 3 more wounded, blood mixing with mud, equipment scattered across 20 yards of jungle trail. Brennan was still alive, barely, making wet, choking sounds as he tried to breathe through a punctured lung. The corpsman was already moving forward, his aid bag bouncing against his hip, his face pale. Howell keyed his radio with shaking hands. Thomas Howell grew up in Asheville, North Carolina, where his father ran a small hardware store on Main Street and his mother taught elementary school. He was the oldest of 4 kids, the responsible one who helped his father with inventory on Saturday mornings and made sure his younger siblings got to school on time. The Vietnam War was something he watched on the evening news until the draft notice came in March 1965, 3 months after his 19th birthday. He didn't burn his draft card or flee to Canada. He went because that's what men from Asheville did. They served. Basic training at Parris Island was 8 weeks of hell, followed by infantry training, and then a transport ship to Da Nang. He arrived in Vietnam in August 1965 as part of the 3rd Marine Division, just in time for Operation Starlight, the first major ground combat operation of the war. He learned quickly that everything the drill instructors taught him about conventional warfare meant nothing in the jungle. The enemy didn't line up and charge. They hit you when you weren't looking, from directions you didn't expect, with weapons you didn't understand. Landmines killed more Marines than bullets in those early months. The toe poppers that blew off feet, the bouncing Bettys that leapt from the ground and exploded at chest height, the command-detonated devices hidden in tree stumps and cooking pots and dead animals. You learned to watch where you walked, to never follow the same trail twice, to trust your instincts when the jungle got too quiet. But even with all that knowledge, Howell had never seen anything like what happened to Golf Company on November 12, 1965, near Chu Lai. Golf Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, was on a routine patrol when they walked into what they thought was an abandoned village. Intelligence said the VC had moved through 2 days earlier. Intelligence was wrong. The mine was mounted in a tree, 20 feet up, angled down the main street of the village. Nobody saw it. Nobody looked up. Why would you? Mines were on the ground, hidden in the dirt, triggered by pressure plates or tripwires at ankle height. But this mine was different. It was a Chinese DH-10, what the Marines would later call a Chi-Com Claymore, and it was aimed like a shotgun down the street where the patrol was walking. When it detonated, the blast wave was visible, a gray-white cloud of shrapnel and smoke that swept through the patrol like a scythe through wheat. 19 Marines went down. 14 died instantly. 5 lingered long enough for the corpsman to try, but the wounds were too severe, too many, too catastrophic. Steel cylinders had punched through body armor, severed limbs, destroyed organs. There was nothing to do but hold their hands while they died. Howell wasn't part of that patrol, but he helped carry the bodies back to base. He counted the wounds, examined the pattern of destruction, talked to the survivors. One of them, a lance corporal named Stevens, kept repeating the same thing over and over. It came from above. It came from the trees. We didn't even see it. The official after-action report listed the cause of death as landmine explosion type unknown. No mention of directional mines. No mention of elevated placement. No mention of the fact that the enemy had adapted American tactics and turned them against American soldiers. Howell wrote a report. 3 pages, detailed observations, survivor testimony, photographs of the blast pattern. He submitted it through his chain of command. It disappeared somewhere between company and battalion, lost in the paperwork, or deemed unimportant by officers who had other things to worry about. The war went on. Patrols kept walking into kill zones, men kept dying, and nobody seemed to notice the pattern. The M18A1 Claymore mine was one of the most successful American weapons of the Cold War. Developed in the 1950s after the human wave attacks in Korea, it was designed to stop mass infantry assaults by firing 700 steel balls in a 60-degree arc across a 100-meter kill zone. The principle was simple: directional fragmentation. Unlike traditional mines that exploded in all directions, the Claymore focused its energy in one direction, maximizing lethality while minimizing danger to friendly forces behind it. American troops in Vietnam used Claymores extensively, especially around base perimeters and defensive positions. They'd string them along the wire at night, set up overlapping fields of fire, connect them to command detonators controlled from bunkers. When the enemy attacked, you push the clacker and watch the kill zone light up like the 4th of July. It was brutally effective. It was also completely predictable. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army studied American tactics with the same intensity that American intelligence studied theirs. They watched how the Claymores were positioned, how they were aimed, how they were detonated. They captured disabled mines from overrun positions, took them apart, reverse-engineered them, and then they built their own. The Chinese Type 66 was a direct copy of the American M18A1, right down to the convex shape and the raised lettering on the front, except the letters were in Chinese characters. But the real innovation was the DH-10, the first-generation directional mine that predated the Type 66. It was cruder, heavier, less refined than the American version, but in many ways more terrifying. The DH-10 looked like a large steel disc mounted on a wooden or metal frame that allowed it to swivel and aim. It held up to 3 pounds of explosive and was packed with steel cylinders, ball bearings, or whatever shrapnel was available. The blast pattern was wider and less focused than the Claymore, but the psychological effect was devastating. And unlike the Claymore, which was designed for defensive use, the DH-10 was built for ambushes. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong used them differently. They'd scout patrol routes, identify choke points, places where trails narrowed or curved, where visibility was limited. They'd mount the mine in a tree or on a stand, aim it down the trail, run the command wire back 200 or 300 yards, and wait. Sometimes they'd wait days. When the patrol finally came, one man with a detonator could kill or wound an entire squad in 2 seconds. No firefight, no risk, no chance for the Americans to return effective fire. Just sudden, overwhelming violence, and then silence. By mid-1967, these directional mine ambushes were killing an average of 20 American soldiers per month in the northern provinces alone. The pattern was consistent. Point man survives because he's already past the kill zone when the mine detonates. Main body of the patrol takes the full blast. Rear element survives, but is often pinned down by secondary fire. Casualties were catastrophic. Morale effects were worse. But the official response from command was slow, confused, and often dismissive. Part of the problem was intelligence failure. The Americans knew the enemy had directional mines. Captured examples had been sent back to Saigon for analysis, but there was no systematic effort to track their use or develop countermeasures. After-action reports listed deaths as mine casualties without specifying type or placement. Nobody was connecting the dots. When junior officers like Thomas Howell tried to raise the alarm, their reports disappeared into the bureaucracy or were dismissed by senior officers who had never seen a DH-10 in action and couldn't imagine the enemy having weapons that sophisticated. There was also the problem of doctrine. American mine warfare training focused on area denial and perimeter defense. You used mines to protect bases, to channelize enemy movements, to slow attacks. The concept of using mines offensively as a primary weapon in ambush operations wasn't part of the tactical playbook. When Americans did use claymores in ambushes, they typically placed them in front of defensive positions along with rifle and machine gun fire. The mine was one element of a combined arms approach. The North Vietnamese used them differently. The mine was the ambush. Everything else, the withdrawal routes, the observation posts, the timing, was built around maximizing the mine's effectiveness. It was a fundamentally different approach to warfare, and American commanders were slow to adapt. By September 1967, Thomas Howell had been in Vietnam for 2 years and 3 months. He'd survived the Ia Drang Valley, Operation Hastings, Operation Prairie, and a dozen smaller engagements whose names never made it into the newspapers. He'd been wounded twice, both times by shrapnel. Both times he refused medevac and stayed with his unit. He'd been promoted to sergeant, given a squad to lead, and earned a reputation as someone who kept his men alive. He was 21 years old and felt 50. The intelligence report came through battalion on September 7th, a week before the ambush that killed 11 men. It was a single page, typed on thin paper, marked for information only. A South Vietnamese Regional Force patrol had found evidence of enemy activity along Route 561, 8 clicks north of their current position. Wire, blast marks, a discarded detonator. The RFs thought it might be a directional mine ambush site, possibly still active. Howell read the report 3 times. He'd seen those blast marks before, back in 1965, after Golf Company got hit. He knew what they meant. He requested permission to conduct a reconnaissance patrol to investigate. His lieutenant, a new officer named Brennan, who'd arrived in country 6 weeks earlier, denied the request. Battalion had other priorities. Intelligence assets were focused on a reported NVA staging area further north. One unconfirmed mine site wasn't worth diverting resources. Howell tried again 2 days later, after another patrol reported hearing movement in the tree line near the same location. Again, denied. On September 12th, 2 days before the ambush, he wrote a formal memo to the company commander, Captain Morrison, detailing the threat and recommending that all patrols in the area alter their routes and increase their interval spacing to minimize casualties if they encountered a directional mine. Morrison read the memo, initialed it, and filed it. No response, no change in patrol procedures, no acknowledgement that the threat was real. Howell was a sergeant. He could advise, but he couldn't give orders. And in the Marine Corps, you followed the chain of command even when the chain of command was wrong. The morning of September 14th started like every other morning. Wake at Oro 400, gear check, weapons inspection, brief from Lieutenant Brennan about the day's mission. They were to patrol north along Route 561, investigate the reported supply cache, and return before dark. 12 men, standard loadout, no artillery support, no air cover. Just another day in the bush. Howell pulled Brennan aside before they moved out. One last try. "Lieutenant, about that intel report from last week." Brennan cut him off. "We're on a different route today, Sergeant. The cache is 3 clicks east of that location." "Sir, the pattern's been consistent. They're using the trails we use. If there's one mine site, there's probably—" "I've read your memo, Sergeant. I've also read the battalion assessment. The threat is considered minimal. We're moving out in 5 minutes. Get your squad ready." Howell bit back what he wanted to say. You couldn't tell a lieutenant he was wrong, not directly, not in front of the men. You could advise, you could suggest, but at the end of the day, the officer made the decision and you executed. Even when you knew the decision was going to get people killed. They moved out at 04:45 under a moonless sky, the jungle black and close, the air thick with moisture. Martinez took point, Howell's best man, sharp eyes and good instincts. Brennan positioned himself second in the patrol order, right behind the point man, which was technically correct by the book, but tactically stupid. If the point man triggered a mine, the patrol leader would be in the kill zone. Howell had tried to explain this to Brennan a week earlier. Brennan had thanked him for the input and ignored it. The trail was narrow, maybe 4 feet wide, packed earth worn smooth by generations of feet. Rice paddies on the left, tree line on the right, mountains in the distance. Beautiful country if you ignored the fact that it was trying to kill you. They moved slowly, methodically, eyes scanning, weapons ready. Martinez stopped every 100 yards to listen, check the ground, look for wires or disturbed earth. He was good, but even the best point man couldn't see everything. At 05:20, they reached the curve in the trail where the jungle pressed close on both sides. Martinez whistled softly, the signal that he was slowing down. Something felt off. Brennan waved him forward. Keep moving. They had a timeline to maintain. Howell, 50 yards back in the patrol order, felt his stomach tighten. This was it. This was where it would happen. He could feel it, the same way he'd felt it before every contact, that electric tingle at the base of his skull that meant violence was coming. He slowed his pace, creating more distance between himself and the man in front of him. The other Marines noticed and adjusted their spacing without being told. They trusted Howell's instincts, even if the lieutenant didn't. 3 more steps. 2. 1. The mine was in a tree at the curve of the trail, mounted on a wooden stand, angled down at 45 degrees, aimed perfectly to catch the patrol as they rounded the bend. The command wire ran back through the undergrowth to a covered position 200 yards away, where a 3-man NVA team had been waiting since before dawn. They'd watched through binoculars as the American patrol approached, counted the men, waited for the right moment. When Martinez reached the kill zone, the team leader held up his hand. Wait. Let more of them get in position. When 7 Americans were in the target area, bunched up because the trail narrowed, he pushed the detonator. The electrical current ran down the wire, triggered the blasting cap, and 2 pounds of Chinese explosive detonated inside the DH-10 steel casing. 700 metal cylinders, each one machined to the right size and weight to maximize penetration and fragmentation, erupted from the front of the mine at supersonic velocity. The physics were simple and brutal. The explosive energy, instead of radiating in all directions, was focused forward by the curved back plate of the mine. The shrapnel spread in a 70-degree arc, wider than an American Claymore, but with the same devastating effect. The fragments hit the Marines at approximately chest height, traveling at nearly 4,000 feet per second, carrying enough kinetic energy to punch through body armor, helmets, web gear, and human flesh like they were made of paper. Martinez, at the front of the kill zone, took impacts across his back and shoulders. The fragments severed his spinal cord at the second vertebra and punctured both lungs. He was dead before his nervous system could register pain. Jenkins, Richardson, Nguyen, and Coleman, bunched together in the middle of the kill zone, took the concentrated center of the blast pattern. The fragments tore through them in a horizontal line, destroying vital organs, severing major arteries, fragmenting bones. Jenkins lost his right arm at the shoulder and bled out in 90 seconds. Richardson took 7 fragments to the chest and abdomen. His heart stopped while he was still falling. Nguyen and Coleman died within seconds of each other, their bodies so shredded by shrapnel that the corpsmen wouldn't be able to tell which wounds were fatal and which were just catastrophic. Lieutenant Brennan, at the edge of the kill zone, caught a dozen fragments in his left side. 2 punctured his lung, 3 fractured ribs, 1 nicked his subclavian artery. He went down gasping, drowning in his own blood, his severed arm hanging by a thread of muscle and skin. He would survive barely, but he'd never command troops again. The Marines behind the kill zone, PFC Torres, Lance Corporal Washington, Private Matthews, and Corporal Danvers, dove for cover as shrapnel whined over their heads. Torres took 2 fragments in the leg. Washington caught 1 in the shoulder. Matthews and Danvers, further back, escaped with minor cuts from flying debris. They returned fire instinctively, pouring rounds into the tree line, but there was nothing there. The enemy team had pushed the detonator and immediately withdrawn, moving west through the jungle toward their fallback position. They'd be 3 clicks away before the Americans called in their casualty report. Howell, at the rear of the patrol, felt the blast wave wash over him like a physical thing, hot and violent and wrong. He stayed down, counting seconds, waiting for secondary explosions or automatic weapons fire. When none came, he moved forward in a low crouch, his rifle up, his eyes scanning the tree line. He reached the kill zone and stopped. The smell hit him first. Copper and shit and burned hair, the smell of violent death that you never forget once you've experienced it. Blood pooled on the trail, dark and thick in the red clay. Body parts lay scattered in the elephant grass. Equipment, rifles, helmets, canteens littered the ground, some of it intact, some of it shredded by shrapnel. 5 men dead, 3 wounded. Half the patrol gone in 2 seconds. The corpsman was already working on Brennan, trying to stop the arterial bleeding, his hands slick with blood. Howell keyed his radio and called for medevac. The response came back immediate. Choppers inbound, 15 minutes out. Mark the LZ with smoke. He organized the survivors quickly. Matthews and Danvers provided security. Weapons trained on the tree line. Washington, despite his shoulder wound, helped the corpsmen stabilize Brennan and Torres. Howell moved through the kill zone, checking bodies, confirming what he already knew. Martinez, Jenkins, Richardson, Nguyen, Coleman, all dead, all under 22 years old, all dead because someone in the chain of command decided the threat wasn't real. He found the blast pattern and followed it back to the source. The tree was obvious once you knew where to look. Bark stripped away by the backblast, branches shattered, wooden stand still attached to the trunk 15 feet up. The mine itself was gone. The explosion had destroyed the casing, but the mounting hardware remained, along with pieces of the command wire. Howell photographed everything with his personal camera, the same camera he'd used to document the golf company massacre 2 years earlier. This time, his report wouldn't disappear. This time, people would listen, or so he thought. The helicopters arrived 12 minutes later, two CH-46C Knights escorted by Huey gunships. They landed in a rice paddy 200 yards from the kill zone while Howell's team carried the wounded through knee-deep mud and water. Brennan was unconscious, gray-faced, his breathing shallow and labored. Torres was screaming, the morphine not working fast enough, bone fragments visible through the torn flesh of his thigh. They loaded the wounded first, then went back for the bodies. The dead went in green bags, zipped up tight, strapped to the helicopter floor. 5 bags. 5 men who'd been alive and joking and homesick 90 minutes ago. The choppers lifted off at Wine, rotors beating the air, carrying the dead and wounded back to the field hospital at Dong Ha. Howell and the 4 remaining Marines stayed behind to secure the site until the EOD team arrived. Explosive ordnance disposal showed up an hour later. 2 specialists who examined the tree photographed the blast pattern, collected fragments of the DH-10 for analysis. The senior EOD tech, a staff sergeant named Kelly, had seen this before. Too many times. Chicom directional mine, he told Howell. DH-10 or maybe a Type 66, hard to tell from what's left. Probably 3 pounds of explosive, steel cylinders for shrapnel. Command detonated. Wire ran back that way. He pointed west into the jungle. They were watching you. Waited until you were in the perfect position, then boom, textbook ambush. I filed reports about this, Howell said, his voice flat, 3 weeks ago. After we found evidence of mine sites in this area, nobody listened. Kelly nodded. Yeah, that's about right. Same thing happened to a platoon from 2nd Battalion last month. Lost 8 men to a DH-10 on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Command said it was an isolated incident. It's not isolated. This is the 4th directional mine ambush in 3 months in this sector alone. Then you need to make them listen, Sergeant, because this shit is only getting worse. The patrol returned to base at 1400, exhausted, filthy, haunted. Captain Morrison met them at the company area, his face tight. He'd already received the casualty report. 5 KIA, 3 WIA. Worst losses the company had sustained in 6 weeks. Howell submitted his after-action report that evening. 8 pages, single-spaced, with photographs and detailed diagrams of the blast pattern, mine placement, and detonation point. He included copies of his previous reports, the intelligence assessments he'd submitted, the memos he'd written to Lieutenant Brennan and Captain Morrison. He documented everything, made every connection, laid out the pattern that had been building for months. The report went to Morrison, who forwarded it to Battalion. Battalion sent it to Regiment. Regiment forwarded it to Division Intelligence. The response came back 3 days later. Report reviewed. Findings noted. Standard patrol protocols remain in effect. Exercise increased vigilance regarding enemy mine activity. That was it. No change in tactics, no new training, no acknowledgement that American patrols were walking into kill zones, because nobody in command wanted to admit the enemy had weapons and tactics that could devastate an entire squad in seconds. Business as usual, more patrols, more casualties, more body bags going home. Howell requested a meeting with Captain Morrison. The conversation took place in Morrison's tent, just the 2 of them, on September 20th. 6 days after the ambush. Morrison looked tired, older than his 32 years, the stress of command aging him in real time. "What do you want, Howell?" "I want to know why my report was ignored, sir." Morrison sighed. "It wasn't ignored. It was reviewed at the highest levels." "And they decided to do nothing." "They decided that current protocols are adequate." "Current protocols got 5 of my men killed, Captain. 5 men who'd still be alive. if someone had listened 3 weeks ago when I first reported the threat. Morrison's jaw tightened. That's not fair, and you know it. We work with the intelligence we have. We can't change our entire operational approach based on one sergeant's suspicions. It's not suspicion, sir. It's evidence. Physical evidence. Pattern analysis. I've documented 4 separate directional mine ambushes in the last 3 months. 4 separate incidents where American patrols walked into kill zones set up by an enemy, using captured or improvised versions of our own weapons. This isn't conjecture. This is happening. And what would you have us do, Sergeant? Stop all patrols? Abandon our operational area? I'd have us adapt, change our patrol routes, increase interval spacing, train our men to recognize the signs of a directional mine ambush, blast marks, command wire, observation posts, use our own counter-ambush tactics, scout suspicious areas with drones, or send in Vietnamese scouts first. Anything except keep doing the same thing and watching men die. Morrison was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You're not wrong, but you're asking me to circumvent the chain of command, to implement tactics that haven't been approved by division, to essentially tell my superiors that they don't know what they're doing. I'm asking you to save lives, sir. And I'm telling you that I can't do that without orders from above. That's not how the Marine Corps works. That's not how any military works." Howell stood up. "Then, with respect, Captain, the Marine Corps is getting Marines killed." He walked out before Morrison could respond. There was nothing more to say. The pattern continued through October and November 1967. 2 more patrols hit directional mines. 1 from Bravo Company, 6 casualties. 1 from Charlie Company, 8 casualties. Each time, the after-action reports documented the same thing. Command detonated directional mine, elevated placement, devastating blast pattern, enemy long gone before reaction forces arrived. Each time, the reports went up the chain of command and disappeared into the bureaucracy. But something was changing. The casualties were mounting. The pattern was too consistent to ignore, and junior officers who'd survived these ambushes were starting to talk to each other, sharing information, developing their own counter-tactics outside the official channels. Lieutenant Colonel Anderson, the battalion intelligence officer, was one of the first senior officers to take the threat seriously. He'd read every after-action report, examined every piece of evidence, talked to survivors. In November, he wrote a classified assessment that went directly to division command. The memo was blunt. Enemy forces have developed and deployed directional fragmentation mines that are tactically and technologically superior to our own defensive mine systems in the context of offensive ambush operations. These weapons are causing disproportionate casualties and severely degrading the effectiveness of our patrol operations in Northern Viet Corps. Current protocols are inadequate. Immediate tactical and training changes are required. The memo included specific recommendations: mandatory pre-patrol reconnaissance of known enemy trail systems, increased spacing between patrol members, training for all infantry personnel on identifying directional mine emplacements, development of counter-mine tactics specifically designed to address this threat. Division Command reviewed the memo in early December. They convened a working group to study the issue. The working group included representatives from infantry, intelligence, and EOD. They examined the evidence, interviewed survivors, consulted with Marine Corps mine warfare experts stateside. By the end of December, they reached the same conclusion Anderson had reached in November. The threat was real, it was growing, and American forces needed to adapt immediately. On January 8, 1968, the 3rd Marine Division issued a new tactical directive: distribution, all infantry units, subject, countermeasures for enemy directional mine threats. The directive was specific and comprehensive. It mandated increased patrol spacing, minimum 10 yards between personnel, 15 yards in known threat areas. It required all patrols to vary their routes and avoid using the same trails repeatedly. It established new reconnaissance protocols, including pre-patrol scouting of suspicious areas and mandatory reporting of any evidence of mine activity. Most importantly, it acknowledged what sergeants like Thomas Howell had been saying for months. The enemy was using captured and improvised versions of American mine technology to deadly effect, and American forces needed to take this threat as seriously as they took conventional ambushes and firefights. The directive also mandated training. Every Marine in the division would receive instruction on identifying directional mines, recognizing ambush sites, and responding to mine attacks. The training included photographs and physical examples of Chinese DH-10 mines captured from enemy positions, so Marines could see what they were facing. Howell was asked to help develop the training program. His photographs from the September ambush were used in the instructional materials. His tactical recommendations, the ones that had been ignored 4 months earlier, became official doctrine. On February 2, 1968, he stood in front of 200 Marines at the Division Training Center and told them about Martinez, Jenkins, Richardson, Nguyen, and Coleman. He showed them the photographs of the kill zone. He explained how the ambush worked, how to spot the warning signs, how to survive if you walked into one. The enemy watches us, he told them. They study our patterns, they learn our tactics, and they use our own weapons against us. They're patient. They'll wait days for the right moment, and when they hit you, it'll be fast and violent and overwhelming. Your best defense is to never give them that moment. Don't use the same trails. Don't bunch up. Watch the tree line. Look up, not just down, and trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. The training worked. Casualties from directional mine ambushes dropped by 60% in the first quarter of 1968. Not because the enemy stopped using them, they didn't, but because American forces learned to recognize the threat and adjust their tactics. Patrols moved differently, more spread out, more aware. They varied their routes. They scouted suspicious areas before committing forces. They looked up. The pattern that had killed 19 Marines in 3 months slowed to a trickle. Lives were saved. Units that implemented the new tactics aggressively reported significant decreases in casualties. But the change came too late for Martinez, Jenkins, Richardson, Nguyen, Coleman, and the dozens of other Marines who died before anyone in command was willing to listen. The war continued. New threats emerged, new tactics, new ways for young men to die far from home. Thomas Howell rotated back to the States in March 1968 with a Bronze Star for valor, a Purple Heart, and memories that would wake him up screaming for the next 40 years. He never talked about the September ambush except to other veterans who'd been there, who understood what it meant to watch men die because someone in command wouldn't listen. The directional mine threat in Vietnam evolved throughout the war. After the initial response in early 1968, enemy forces adapted their tactics. They used more sophisticated command detonation systems, better camouflage, more complex ambush sites with multiple mines covering different approach routes. The Americans adapted in turn, developing better reconnaissance techniques, deploying specialized countermine teams, using aerial surveillance to identify potential ambush sites. It became a deadly chess game, move and counter-move, each side trying to stay ahead of the other. The statistics tell part of the story. Between 1965 and 1967, before the tactical changes, directional mine ambushes killed or wounded over 300 American servicemen in I Corps alone. After the changes, that number dropped to fewer than 100 in the same time period. Improved tactics worked, but they only worked because junior NCOs like Howell refused to shut up, even when their reports were ignored, even when their recommendations were dismissed. The official documentation of the threat didn't appear in training manuals until late 1968, nearly 3 years after the first documented directional mine ambush. By then, it was part of the standard threat briefing given to every new arrival in Vietnam. But the manuals didn't mention Howell's name, or Anderson's, or any of the other junior officers and NCOs who'd pushed for change. The credit went to senior command, to the generals and colonels who'd eventually signed off on the new tactics. That's how military bureaucracy works. The people who identify the problem rarely get credit for solving it. Post-war analysis by Army and Marine Corps planners validated every recommendation Howell had made in September 1967. Increased spacing, route variation, enhanced reconnaissance, specific training on directional mine threats. All of it became standard doctrine not just for Vietnam, but for subsequent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, where insurgent forces used similar tactics with IEDs and command-detonated explosives. Modern counter-IED training traces its lineage directly back to the lessons learned in Vietnam, though few current service members know that history. The threat hasn't changed, just the technology. The enemy still studies American tactics, still looks for patterns, still uses American blind spots against American forces, and American forces still learn, slowly and expensively, that adaptation and tactical flexibility matter more than doctrine and procedure. Thomas Howell survived the war and went home to Asheville. He enrolled at UNC Chapel Hill on the GI Bill, earned a degree in history, became a high school teacher. He married a woman named Sarah from Durham, had 2 daughters, coached youth baseball, led a quiet life that bore no resemblance to the violence he'd experienced in Vietnam. Once a year, on September 14th, he made phone calls to Martinez's mother in San Antonio, to Jenkins's sister in Detroit, to the families of Richardson, Nguyen, and Coleman. He'd talk for a few minutes, remember their sons and brothers, make sure they knew that those men hadn't died alone, hadn't been forgotten. In 1985, a military historian researching Marine Corps small unit tactics in Vietnam found references to the directional mine threat in declassified after-action reports. The pattern was obvious once you knew to look for it. Multiple incidents, consistent casualties, tactical similarities. The historian tracked down survivors, including Howell, and conducted interviews. Howell agreed to one meeting. They talked for 4 hours in Howell's kitchen while Sarah made coffee and the afternoon light faded outside. Howell told him about the September ambush, about the reports he'd filed, about watching men die while command did nothing. He showed him the photographs he'd kept, the ones he'd taken at the kill zone, the evidence that eventually forced the Marine Corps to change its tactics. "Why didn't you push harder?" the historian asked. "Why didn't you go over your chain of command, talk to the press, make someone listen?" Howell was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Because I was a sergeant, and sergeants follow orders, even when the orders are wrong. That's what the military teaches you: discipline, obedience, trust in the chain of command. And most of the time that works. That's how you win wars. But sometimes the chain of command fails. Sometimes the people making decisions are so far removed from the reality on the ground that they can't see what's obvious to everyone else. And when that happens, good men die. Do you think you could have saved those 5 Marines? I know I could have. If someone had listened to my first report, if we'd changed our patrol tactics 3 weeks earlier, they'd still be alive. Martinez would be 40 years old now. Jenkins would have kids. Richardson was going to be a teacher. And they're all dead because I was just a sergeant, and sergeants don't make policy. The historian published his findings in the Journal of Military History in 1987. The article was titled Tactical Adaptation and Organizational Resistance, the Directional Mine Threat in Vietnam, 1965-1968. It documented the pattern of casualties, the delayed command response, the junior NCOs who pushed for change against institutional resistance. Howell's name appeared once, listed among other NCOs who'd filed reports. The article credited senior Marine Corps leadership with eventually implementing effective counter-tactics. Thomas Howell died in 2003 at the age of 57, heart attack while mowing his lawn. His obituary in the Asheville Citizen-Times mentioned his military service and his career as a teacher. It didn't mention the Bronze Star or the Purple Heart or the fact that he'd tried to save lives in Vietnam and been ignored until it was too late. Sarah knew he'd done something important, something that cost him sleep and peace of mind for 35 years. But she never knew exactly what. The men whose lives were saved by the tactical changes implemented in 1968 never knew Howell's name, never knew that a sergeant from North Carolina had fought his chain of command to protect them. That's how it works. The people who prevent disasters rarely get recognition because the disasters never happen. The tactics Howell advocated are still taught. Modern infantry training emphasizes tactical flexibility, pattern avoidance, enhanced spacing, constant adaptation to enemy tactics. The principle hasn't changed since 1967. The enemy studies you, learns your patterns, and uses them against you. Your survival depends on never giving them that opportunity. Sometimes the most important innovations in warfare don't come from think tanks or war colleges or generals with decades of experience. Sometimes they come from sergeants in the mud who watch their friends die and refuse to accept that this is just how war works. Sometimes they come from men who write reports that get ignored, who push back against institutional inertia, who keep fighting even when nobody wants to listen. Thomas Howell was one of those men. He couldn't save Martinez, Jenkins, Richardson, Nguyen, and Coleman, but he saved hundreds of others, men who never knew his name, who went home to their families because someone had the courage to say, "The Emperor has no clothes, the tactics aren't working, and we need to change." The memorial at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., lists 58 of those 318 names. 5 of them died on September 14, 1967, in Quang Tri Province, killed by a Chinese directional mine in an ambush that could have been prevented. Their names are etched in black granite, permanent and absolute. Thomas Howell's name isn't on the wall. He came home, lived a full life, died in his own bed surrounded by family. But he carried those 5 names with him every day for 36 years, carried them like a weight that never got lighter, a reminder that sometimes doing the right thing isn't enough. Sometimes the system fails despite your best efforts, and sometimes good men die because someone else made a bad decision. That's the real story of the directional mine threat in Vietnam. Not a story of technological innovation or tactical brilliance, but a story of institutional failure and individual courage. A story about the disconnect between the men who fight wars and the men who plan them. A story about what happens when the chain of command stops listening to the voices from the field. And a reminder that even in defeat, even in failure, there's honor in trying. If you found this story meaningful, please like this video. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for remembering these men and their sacrifice.